might get started. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the ACT branch of the AIIA. My name is Heath McMichael and I'm branch president. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. Well, the recent visit by the Chinese Premier attracted widespread attention, not least here in the national capital. That, of course, is unsurprising given China's increasingly pivotal position in geopolitics and international economic relations. Over the last year or so in this branch, we've heard a number of security perspectives that convey a view of China's role in world and Indo-Pacific affairs in starkly confrontational terms, I might say. But tonight we're having another look at China, this time a worm's eye view from an informed insider who has had a long and sustained engagement with that country. We're delighted that Professor Jocelyn Chey is with us tonight to provide that worm's eye view. Jocelyn is visiting professor in the School of Languages and Cultures at Sydney Uni, adjunct professor in the Australia-China Institute for Arts and Culture at Western Sydney Uni, and professor at the Australia-China Relations Institute in the University of Technology, Sydney. And that's one large academic agenda, I'm sure. Jocelyn was one of the earliest students in Australia to take up Chinese language studies in the 1950s. She completed her master degree at the University of Hong Kong and her doctorate at Sydney University. In 1973, she was appointed China Relations Officer in the Department of Overseas Trade before being posted to Beijing as the first Australian Cultural Counsellor in 1975. She was the first Executive Director of the Australia-China Council, 1979 to 84, Senior Trade Commissioner in Beijing, 1985 to 88, and Consul General to Hong Kong between 1992 and 1995. We're especially pleased that Jocelyn is here as she is a counsellor on the New South Wales branch of the AIIA and indeed a fellow of the Institute. So, apart from other things, she's been awarded the Australia-China Council Medal in 2008 and became a member of the Order of Australia in 2009. She's published widely on Chinese humour, cultural diplomacy and China's international relations. So before we start, let me just make a couple of housekeeping announcements. As per our normal format, Jocelyn will speak for 25 minutes or so. Mm-hmm. Yep. Before we go to questions from participants in-house and those of participants online who can use the Q&A function on Zoom, thank you. Now we aim to finish at 7 p.m. So without further ado, Jocelyn, over to you, please.
Thank you, Heath. Good evening, everyone. And I also would like to acknowledge the land that we meet on, which is the unceded land of the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to them that any may be here tonight in particular. Now, first I have to explain the title of my talk because people have been asking me. When I say a worm's eye view, what I mean is my own personal and therefore obviously limited view, and its exact opposite is the bird's eye view, because a bird looks down from above and therefore its view has greater breadth and depth. Now, my engagement in the Australia-China relationship, as you've just heard, has extended over more than half a century. So tonight, what I intend to do is to indulge in some reminiscences. And from them, I hope to draw out some lessons. That is, hoping that we can all learn from history and that may perhaps help us to manage this important relationship with China better in the future. But I do emphasize this is a very personal view, and that's why I've called it a worm's eye view. So to start at the beginning, my initial interest in China was academic. I knew nothing about China from my education at school. At university, when I discovered the riches of Chinese culture, it was therefore extra exciting. And I immersed myself in the study of over 2,000 years of poetry, philosophy, art, and literature, and I was entranced. Of course, that was 70 years ago, when Australia didn't regard itself really as part of Asia or even a neighbor of Asia. And you might think that these days, nothing like that could possibly happen. But unfortunately, I have to tell you, that's not the case. So the first point I would like to make is the importance of language and cultural studies for Australia, because we are a country that's always depended on trade and on our relations, particularly with our neighbours. And our future depends on that and on communication and understanding. So if we're going to learn to coexist with China, then surely we have to start by learning about its history and culture. And that's not just the present day society and the present day politics and present day economics. In fact, one of our leading sinologists, Jeremy Barmay, has talked about new sinology, which is what he means is that you must know the past as well as the present, otherwise you will never understand either. So Chinese culture, in fact, has a deep respect for history, and Chinese people are very proud of their literature and art, and they are studied their core subjects at school and university. However, these days, their interpretation of their history is increasingly constrained by ideology and by a rather, I think, rather crude version of nationalism. And in fact, I found this out not just recently, but back in the early 1960s, when, as Heath has said, I was a postgraduate student in Hong Kong. And there was, at that time, a major international conference to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the University of Hong Kong. It's as old as the University of Sydney. And the keynote speaker was a famous sociologist, Wolfram Eberhardt, who talks in particular about the ethnic composition of the peoples of China and what you might call Greater China. And he made some observations about the complex ethnic composition of the Hong Kong people. For instance, the Tanka, or so-called boat people, who have the oldest evidential archaeological finds are of the places where they had landed but not lived on the islands around Hong Kong. And he said that they were not the same as the Han Chinese. Now, this caused an enormous stink in the local press, and he was condemned right, left, and center, saying that he didn't understand and all Chinese were the same, and we are all Chinese, and you cannot distinguish between one kind of Chinese and another. So I realized at that time that there was a very nationalistic interpretation of history. And it's interesting to recall that today because you find exactly that same kind of attitude in China these days, but it's not something new. It's something very deep in the Chinese consciousness. So that's the first observation I'd make. So there I was as a scholar, and I wasn't being a young person. And those days, I somehow didn't really worry about employment or making money. But in fact, my first job sort of fell into my lap while I was still in Hong Kong. And I was asked to help with, to work as what they called then a China watcher. And remember, this was the days leading up to the Vietnam War, when the world urgently wanted to know what China was going to do. What were the relations between China, between Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh, and whether when the Chinese said that they were going to support their Vietnamese neighbors, what kind of support did they actually mean? So lesson number 2 from my reminiscences is that I realized that China's influence in the region and internationally is not simply a consequence of it having become a strong economic power, that even in those days when China's economy was quite weak, it was still vital to understand what was going on in China. So part of my task as a China watcher was to read inordinately long and difficult official party documents, a kind of verbal gobbledygook, which was known popularly in Chinese as Dang Bagu, which means party essay writing. People compared it, in fact, with the kind of formulaic writing that essays that students had to write when they sat for the imperial examinations. And there's a particular skill in digesting and interpreting this kind of literature and gleaning from it little morsels of information. And that kind of skill is still very important for understanding China today. As you read Xi Jinping, who writes, he must write every day because the bookshops in China are full of his writings, and they are all inordinately long and full of what I still think could be described as dagbagu, and you have to read it and glean from it what morsels that you can to understand what's really going on. So anyway, it was at that time when I was in Hong Kong in the 60s that I became quite involved in the local, not so much the expatriate community, but the local young Chinese community. And I found we're all very earnest and very much involved and China watchers themselves, very much trying to understand what was going to happen in China and what was happening in global politics. And there were, of course, very fierce factions, pro-mainland and pro-Taiwan, and the time of their national festivals, they would even fight between each other. So I fell in love with one young man whose family, in fact, were refugees having come from North China, where they had been labeled as class enemies and their property and their businesses confiscated, and those who remained in the country had perished. But in spite of that family history, he and his friends were very passionate about China's future. And my husband, as he became, was a very wise advisor and consultant when I had any difficulty in understanding what was going on in China. So I must take this opportunity of giving credit to him. And we came back to Sydney in the 60s at a time before even the White Australia policy had been abolished. And although he found it very difficult to fit in here because there were very few Asian people in Australia, he was determined to become part of this society. And from that, I derive another lesson, which is that people's loyalties are complex, and it is possible to be a citizen of the world while still valuing your personal and family traditions. So we're in the 1960s. It's 15 years after the Communist Revolution, and the US policy was trade embargo with Communist China, and Australia, its ally, was expected to follow. But it was the Australian Wheat Board that broke that blockade and sold wheat to China, which was in fact suffering a disastrous famine. And Deputy Prime Minister at the time was Jack McEwen, who said, "I know of no incident in history where peace and goodwill have been fostered by a government setting out to deny the people of another country ordinary foodstuffs." And that courageous stand was never forgotten in China. Later, when I went to work there, it was frequently mentioned to me. And so now, next lesson is long-term relationships. And this kind of stands are not forgotten in China. And trust and diplomacy are built up over time. We have sometimes a more short-term kind of thinking. And I'm reminded of the instance often quoted when Kissinger had an interview with the former Premier Zhou Enlai and asked him what he thought of the French Revolution. And Zhou Enlai said, "It's still too early to tell." So that's the Chinese attitude to history. Then after the election of the Whitlam government, I moved to Canberra. I joined the Department of Overseas Trade. And I was put to work on what practical benefits Australia might win from this new relationship. One of my jobs, I recall, was to deal with correspondence from the public. The public were very excited about this new relationship and full of advice for the minister. I remember one letter or more than one letter, where people wrote about the opportunities for Australian wool exports and what a good idea it would be if we sent someone to China to teach the Chinese people how to knit. Because if each Chinaman had just one woolen sock, that would take up the whole of the Australian wool production. It was a rather ridiculous task, but what it made me realize is that there is a particular attitude towards our relations with China and with other countries, where we think we know what's good for you and we are doing you a favor. And I'm sorry to say, it is a really essentially colonialist attitude, and it's something that we have to guard against in our dealings with China and with other countries. We don't have a monopoly of technology. The Chinese people are much better knitters than most of us ever will be. Well, if there were misunderstandings on our side about China, the same also existed on the other side, and we learned that very quickly. The Communist Party had been telling people ever since the 1949 that Europe and the US had a history of imperial ambitions. And they've been, of course, through the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So there was a great suspicion of foreigners. And if we made naive expressions of good intention, that wasn't necessarily believed. They certainly distrusted the US, and we were known to be a close ally. So as the cultural council, as you heard, but I'll just give you one example. One of my first tasks was to negotiate and help to organize a major Australian art exhibition. You would think this was a non-political task, but each artist, his class background, his political affiliation, each painting, its implication, its technique had to be identified and discussed and negotiated. So that just shows, that it wasn't a simple thing just to arrive there and immediately to have that relationship of trust and goodwill. It wasn't easy then, and it's not even easy today. From that time, I began to think about how one should really organize cultural exchanges. And it's my belief that it's better and more effective if the ideas and the proposals for cultural exchanges come from the artists and the writers, the creative people themselves. And it is bottom up. It is those exercises where the government decides, China would love to learn would really appreciate AFL football, that it's a political agenda from Canberra that doesn't necessarily translate into a welcome on the ground. So at that time also, as part of this exercise, I began to learn how to navigate very complex government regulations that exist in China as they exist in all large bureaucracies. And I'll just give you one example. The very first lesson derived from how to write my name on the list of diplomatic appointments in the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs handbook. They'd never had to list a female with an accompanying husband before. And my husband refused it to be listed as Madame. He also had his own Chinese name, and he didn't like taking a perfectly good Chinese surname, Qi, and then translating it as Cha from the English spelling of it. So this held up the publication of the diplomatic handbook for several months while the Chinese side wrestled with this. More seriously was an episode which has been mentioned to me by a retired Chinese diplomat who now lives in Australia. He said, "Oh, I know your case, And this was the episode that he related to me. The very first day I started work in the office, my husband decided to take himself out for a walk around the city. And he happened to say, he objected to being pushed and shoved by a sort of security person, and ended up being detained and questioned, and who are you? And because it was the first day, he had neither his Australian passport, which we'd had to hand in for registration, or the ID card, which we were later issued with to identify ourselves. So as he was unable to verify who he was or where he came from, they were highly suspicious of him. So I told Australian language students who came to China that learning to get through and navigate the lessons of these hurdles of bureaucracy was a very important life skill, and it was just as important for them as acquiring language skills. My next part that I want to deal with is later in the 1980s, when China started to open up more with the period that they call reform and opening. And at that time, Chinese leaders realized that their development depended on accessing foreign technology and resources. And overseas study would accelerate the upskilling that they needed for new industries and modern enterprises. So both sides came to realize that the economies of each country were highly complementary, and China began to engage more in the international trading system and prepared for membership of the World Trade Organization. So officials and entrepreneurs had to accommodate to different ways of doing things. And here in Australia, we had a very important role to play in that process. It's interesting that China's first major overseas investment was in Australia. That was the joint venture Channa iron ore mine in the Pilbara. And it succeeded because the relationship was built up over more than a decade before the mine even opened, and that both sides learned to trust each other, overcoming a number of painful lessons in the process. So there was greater potential, but not everybody was on board. Not everybody was supportive. Another episode that I'd like to mention is that the small Australian business community in Beijing at that time were divided on the benefits of doing business in China. And those were the people who were actually there. So what I recall is a farewell dinner when I was leaving my post as Senior Trade Commissioner. It was hosted by the, should I say, BHP representative, who was the senior businessman there. And he took it upon himself in sort of farewelling me to say that he thought that I'd been embarked on the wrong route the whole time I was there, and I should really have been telling Australian businesses not to bother coming to China because there was nothing to be gained from the relationship. We almost had to be physically separated after that. It was a very unpleasant experience. So that's sort of, not everybody is on board. All that was what I realized even back then. That was 1988. China's internationalization was just beginning, but there was potential for two-way trade and exchanges. Now, for the following 4 years, and I think you didn't mention this, I was the director of the China branch of the International Wool Secretariat, opening up the market for Australian wool. And that was at the time when the countries of Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, and China, all were developing, but their products were based on high quality Australian raw materials. So the IWS supplied technical know-how and the guarantee of quality, the Woolmark logo. And then Chinese products, which were guaranteed to have high quality Australian wool in them, found a niche market in the United States and Europe and around the world. It was a very fulfilling part of my professional career. And I look back on it with great affection, because this time I was not simply representing Australia and negotiating with the other side, which was China, but the two of us were working together for a common goal, which was to benefit both the Australian wool growers and the Chinese producers and designers and exporters, the marketing people. And that is a really quite a different experience when you're working with someone rather than simply engaging with them. It was going very well until June 1989. Now you will recall that the events of what is now mostly called the Tiananmen Massacre, although that term is avoided by some. I wasn't in China, but I watched the events on television in Hong Kong, and I flew to Beijing just 3 days later, at a time when the tarmac was still corrugated from the tank tracks that tanks had gone past, and you could see the bullet holes in the buildings along the street, and even blood stains that hadn't been washed off the walls. So there was no hiding what had actually happened there. And there was a worldwide revulsion at the abuse of human rights. It also caused a great setback to international relations, including trade. And for the IWS, that shock flowed through until the wool marketing system collapsed in '92 through the buildup of stocks of wool. And that meant that I was out of a job. So, even big effects can have, people can be affected by major events like that in a sort of flow-on array. Now, all countries are vulnerable to this kind of crisis, sort of black swan incidents. And China and other centralized economies more than perhaps than others, because there's no hiding the fact that the fault can be sheeted home to the central government. You can't pass it off and say that's just a local problem or a commercial problem or so on. An authoritarian country, therefore, knows this and becomes highly risk adverse. They want to prevent any kind of what the Chinese call luan, and chaos developing. And that simply reinforces, it's a vicious cycle for reinforcing the controls that come in. So the decade of the 1990s was time for me to move on to other challenges. And I was posted to Hong Kong as Consul General in the last years before the return of the territory to Chinese rule. The terms of the handover had been determined by Britain in 1984, and Australia had accepted that this was going to happen. But particularly after 1989, there were concerns about a possible erosion of civil rights. And the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, made some modifications to the Hong Kong's basic law to try to protect, as far as he could, civil rights. And it was my job to convince our then Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, to support Patten's proposed reforms, which he did, we did, the government did. And as a result of that, both not only Chris Patten, but also Gareth Evans, and even I got called all kinds of bad names and told that China never wanted to have anything more to do with us and so on. However, next lesson to be learnt is when there is a particularly important issue on which you should take a stand, then don't waver about it. Be firm and explain the reasons for your decision, and be confident that in the end, that a practical accommodation will be reached. And these things will pass. Well, then I came back to Canberra, and then John Howard was elected our new prime minister, and there was, as some people will remember, the Night of the Long Knives, and the not quite decimation, but a large proportion of the senior public service was made redundant, and I took my leave of Canberra and returned to Sydney. It was a good time to leave, I think. It was following on Pauline Hanson's concerns about being swamped by Asians. And what I saw then is the new incoming administration retreated from the values of multiculturalism and instead promoted ties with Anglophone countries. Just when China was becoming a truly global power, Australia shrank back into its shell. And the attack on the Twin Towers in New York in 2001 just drove us further into the embrace of our US ally. But relations with China had their own momentum, and they didn't immediately stop. In fact, they built continually through the first decade of the current century, probably peaking in 2015 with the signing of our free trade agreement with China. And another critical point was 2010, where the year of Australian culture in China and Australian participation in the World Expo in Shanghai. How are we going for time?
Well, another 5 minutes would be good.
Well, I've only got another 20 years to
Yes, we're enjoying the journey.
So, I went to Shanghai to see how our promotion was going. And what I found was that the best thing about that promotion that was most appreciated by visitors were all the Chinese-speaking young Australian guides who were really friendly and had a good casual way of interacting with the visitors. It made a great impression on all the visitors. On the other hand, the pavilion itself, designed by a famous Australian architect in sort of rust-colored steel, that was supposed to reference, agricultural history and industrial history of Australia, didn't seem to be pointing the way forward at all, but harking back to a sort of Australia that I thought we were beginning to leave behind. So that was a mixed opinion about how things should go. Another issue I'd like to mention is that around about that time, an issue arose in Australia that occupied me, and I became a bit notorious, and that was the establishment of Confucius Institutes in Australian universities. See, I was back in Sydney, and I learnt of a proposal to establish such an institute at my alma mater, to be funded jointly by the university and the Chinese Ministry of Education and staffed by lecturers from China. And I objected strongly to that and made my objections known. Not really that they proposed to promote Chinese language and culture, but why should they locate the institute on the campus? And should Australian universities accept funding from a foreign government to carry out teaching and research? So that, I think, began quite a debate about, the Chinese influence or attempts to influence Australia. That was simply the beginning of it. It peaked with the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Amendment Act of 2018. But to me, the Confucius Institutes were the first indication that we do have a problem. My concern at that time was about the university aspect of it, but it is a wider problem than that. However, it's not to say that we should shouldn't have institutional links and we shouldn't have exchange programs. Now, in conclusion, I think, if you will give me just a few more minutes, because this week has been the week of the visit by the Chinese Premier, so I think I should conclude by saying a few comments about that. Regardless of any specific outcomes, and there will be quite a number of important outcomes, the fact that the visit took place was an achievement in itself. And I think it's very unfortunate that the headlines in the Australian press have focused on attempts by Chinese officials to block the coverage of Cheng Lei, who was there representing Sky News. Now, you remember Cheng Lei spent 3 years in detention in China before she was released last year. And it was a very unfortunate incident, but it was like a sideshow, really, to the main event, which was the visit of the Premier. And it's an instance, I think, of the problem that we have on both sides with how to handle the press. On the Chinese side, in the view that, and we knew this even back in the 1970s, the media are there to serve the government and to convey the Chinese government line. And they still have difficulty accommodating to our system where the press are independent. And management of the media and the press are complex and getting ever more complex now when we have social media assuming a greater and greater importance. Our own government finds it difficult to handle the media, as one could give a lot of examples. But when the Western media is almost uniformly critical of China, then you can see that Beijing has a monumental task. It's unfortunate that almost all English language or Western reporting of China is negative. There was a recent study, not of Australia, but of coverage of China in the British press that showed that it had focused exclusively on the negative, to the extent that one commentator said that it could be considered slanderous. John Sudworth, who was a former BBC correspondent in China, told the investigators who produced this report that his aim when he was there was to highlight negative developments. And I quote, "The job of good journalists everywhere is to tell stories that those in power don't want us to tell." I mean, journalists actually have another responsibility, according to the Society of Professional Journalists, and should take precedence, is their duty is to write accurate, fair, and thorough accounts. But bad news sells. And the management of protests presents another problem. Now, we have many recent examples of guerrilla-type climate protests, demonstrations for and against Gaza, Gaza war, the Indian Prime Minister Modi, Sikh independence, Hong Kong, Tibet, Uyghurs, Falun Gong, and for and against the government and the party of China. It's not new. Just one final reminiscence. I can remember an occasion when Alexander Downer was our foreign minister, and he was giving a speech at the University of Sydney, and there were student protests outside the Great Hall against our involvement in the Iraq War. So I thought I'd go and listen to Downer, but I couldn't get into the hall and outside waiting also, there was a group of Chinese provincial government officials who were at the university on a management training course. And their lecturer had told them that it would be instructive for them to go and listen to the foreign minister's speech. And they couldn't get in. So I was sympathizing with them. And their reply I thought was interesting. They said, "Oh, we don't mind at all. It's much more informative for us to learn about how you allow protests and how you manage protests. And that's something we really need to learn about." So China can't be understood simply in terms of stereotypes and generalizations. There's a lot to admire, there's a lot to forgive, and there's a lot to criticize. We can't just rely on cliches and catchphrases. Most of them are meaningless. I put these random thoughts together under the title of Worm's Eye View, and I would like to conclude by quoting the words of a contemporary Melbourne poet, George Crocos, who wrote, "It's said that it's the early bird which catches the worm, and that in matters of principle, we should all stand firm. But what if birds are many and worms are few? These principles that we adhere to are unjust and untrue." Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that's all. It's a wonderful introduction to our discussion tonight, I think. We'll turn to questions now. Let me just ask the first one. You've mentioned a few life principles that you derived from your time working with and in China, the value of long-term relationships, and you referred to John McEwen at that time, the need for firmness, amongst others. But could I ask you to let us know what you think are the most important of those principles when dealing with China?
I don't think they're any different with the principles that relate to dealing with your spouse or your colleagues or your neighbors, that don't jump to conclusions. Every issue has got two sides to it. And as Sun Tzu said in his famous treatise about the art of war, you have to know yourself and know your enemy.
Very good. Okay, now questions from the floor, please, first of all. Okay, Bill.
Your comments at the beginning of your presentation about language studies, and I'm struck by how many people in contact have had about China on television, for example. No, that's not what we're about in Chinese language. And I'm wondering whether we are under-investing as a country in the study of Asian languages, and at what point in the education system it's important to begin making the study of complex languages available in order to bring people by the end of the university career to a level of fluency that can enable them to function effectively in a language such as Chinese.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I started with this point because I think it's a fundamental point. And it's regrettable that we've had over the recent decades several reviews of our education policy, which have all advised the government that they should be greater in encouragement of the study, particularly of Asian languages. And then with our wonderful democratic system, you have a change of government. Oh, and that was a policy that the last government espoused, so we're not going to continue it. But I have written, and other people have written on this subject, and we won't give up. I think it doesn't matter. I mean, where to start, what level it should be, whether I'm not quite sure. I mean, obviously, the younger you are, the easier it is to learn a foreign language. But I didn't take up Chinese until I got to university. I think there are great advances in our understanding of educational practice and techniques. And many people nowadays can achieve quite remarkable results, even from learning online, you know. It doesn't have to be a university or a school program, but it should be encouraged. And not just for Chinese, you know. I mean, our friends who grow up in Europe all speak 2 or 3 languages, and that's regarded as being de rigueur. Why is Australia? We think that English is the only proper language in the world. It's a reflection, I think, of that kind of colonialist attitude. And if they don't understand you, then just speak louder.
Any other questions there? Yes, John.
John Schilling, Jocelyn. I was wondering whether you thought that Chinese literary culture was either better or much better preserved than our Western culture, dating from the Greeks and so on, where we have many references to works, but not the works themselves. Have they been better at preserving that culture than we have?
Well, I think it's quite remarkable when to be able to read the poems of poets who were writing in the 4th century, for instance. I've recently been rereading some poems by a nature poet called Xie Lingyun at that period, you know, and they are beautiful. And I was telling my friend Han Fang that I've been given, I know you're online, thank you. My friends just gave me a book of translations of Chinese poetry, which was done by a Chinese scholar who was at Cambridge University in the 30s. So they're a little old-fashioned, the other translation, but it's a lovely selection of poems. And in a very moving introduction to that volume from Cambridge University Press, the great literary scholar Arthur Quiller Couch writes about the intellectual atmosphere in Britain at that time. And remember, this is as the Nazis were gathering power in Germany. And he said, I would advise our poets in England all to read classical Chinese poems, because very few of them write about war. And if they do write about war, they write about how silly and futile it is and about the horrors of war. And we all need that kind of compassion that you find in the writings of classical Chinese poets. So that struck me. Thank you very much, Michelle, for that volume. Yeah, I paid you back for it.
Jocelyn, there's a question online from Alan McCormick here along this line of the pathways to an understanding of China, asking, are there traditional texts such as Journey to the West that provide an understanding of Chinese history, literature and culture? So I don't know whether you know about that text.
Oh, well, I don't know, but I do recall that my professor, when I was as an undergraduate, advised us that we should read it's like 3 volumes novel called The Dream of the Red Chamber, which is a story of a great, it's a sort of Forsyte saga. It says, you know, many generations in a big family. And he said, if you really want to understand the Chinese psyche and their way of accommodating, living with each other, so you will learn more from reading this novel than from anything else. So that's one person's opinion.
Pathway. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, back here, and then you, Rod.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So my question about China studying Australia. You know, the ARC is cutting a budget about China's related study in Australia, and many China scholars are complaining this. So how do you think in today's Australia we can make the China study more relevant and more significant to the Australian society? Thank you.
Well, it's a big question. But one thing that I think is becoming more and more common in universities, it didn't exist when I was an undergraduate, are exchange programs. And I do think that, many school and university students learn a lot from time spent in an overseas country. And it's a shame that that used to happen a little with China. I'm hoping now that, relations are improving a bit, that we can resume those sort of exchange arrangements, because I think that would be one very practical way of making the study more interesting and more relevant to young people.
Okay, right.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I just wonder, when you look at the sweep of China's history, in any reflection you can say on China's history before the Communist Revolution. Now there seems, I'm not an expert at all in the area, but seems to be, I've seen analysis that suggests that there's this reinvention of history by the Communist Revolution, which seem they respect their early history, but not, and then they change their history, seem to reinvent it in recent times. Is this something we should be concerned about? Or is it?
Well,
Is there some continuum really?
well, yeah, I mean,
Culture.
those people involved in the science or study of history will tell you that history is written by the victors, and we're all rewriting history. Australia, has its own version of Australian history, and it's currently being rewritten. When I first came to Australia, there was no mention of Aboriginal history at all in Australia. Now, of course, you can't write about Australian history without writing about so we all do it, and there are political priorities to it. But yes, certainly, Chinese Communist Party has rewritten history. Yeah, it's the job of those of us who want to, let's say, to really be thorough in our understanding, not to accept just one version and a second-hand version, but to go back to the original sources and to verify and to challenge. It's not a simple thing. Don't accept any one book or any one author as having a monopoly of the information.
Just on that, Jocelyn, I wonder if you could comment on whether China watching is best around the world these days. I mean, you've been in Hong Kong as a China watcher from the 60s, but that role perhaps is ceded now. Where would you go to get your views on, most informed views on China?
Oh, well.
England or the United States? Or
Well, I'm going to make some enemies. I bet there was. I think that I would have to say the advice that I'm going back to what my Professor Bertie Davis at the University of Sydney told us. He said, you can't, if you really want to understand China, you have to read what is written by Japanese scholars. So we were all made to learn to study Japanese as well as Chinese.
And he would say that today.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Now, are there any other questions? We've still got a few minutes if people want to. Yes, Bill, by all means.
One of the things that's actually struck me looking back over periods since 1949 is that whilst there's been sort of relatively standard commitment to ideological positions, there's been a great deal of political turbulence during that period of like the fall of the Cultural Revolution, the Gang of Four, and I'm wondering what kind of discontinuities between the present and the future might be associated with a transition to a post-Xi Jinping regime.
Yes.
Is it a very open kind of prospect at the moment?
Yeah, yes, well, I'm reading a book at the moment, which I will recommend to you. It's called Private Revolutions. And it is written by a Chinese-British author called Yuan, surname is Yuan, Y-U-A-N, Yang, I think, Y-A-N-G. And she's was, having been born in China and grew up in England and went back to China as a correspondent for the Financial Times. And she has interviewed a few, let's say, middle-aged women of the same age as her, who have grown up in this period when China has become prosperous and very ordinary people. So some of them, you know, their parents were illiterate and they went to village schools and had hardly any education themselves. And then they've had to find jobs in factories and move to the cities. And there's that process of urbanization. And now there's the, you know, coming of the internet, and everybody has a mobile phone, and there's much more, and all these social changes going on. So life, not just from one generation to another, but like each decade, my Chinese friends talk about, you know, these people are 80s, these are the 80s people, and these are the 90s people, and these are the, I suppose we call it noughties people. They all have a very different perspective on life. And I don't know what life is going to be like for those who are now at school and growing up and going to be living in a China that's again very different, because the you know, this is an unfolding process. I mean, China has still got enormous disparities between advanced cities and backward rural areas. It's not uniform across the whole country. So I can't really, I mean, think that needs a bird's eye view, not a worm's eye view.
All right, well, I'll give the last question to Penny Wensley, who's online,
Ah, Penny.
who knows the region so very well. And I've just lost it now, but I think, anyway, it was along the lines of, were we a bit too optimistic in seeing the one China policy, to one China, two systems? And in particular with relation, in relation to Taiwan, have you got any comments on the management of China's relationship with Taiwan, and indeed Australia's?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Penny was in my predecessor in Hong Kong, so I guess her question is mainly about Hong Kong. But you say one China, I mean, that was the basis of the of Whitlam's recognition of China, but that was not referring to Hong Kong.
Yeah,
That
but
was-
well, she's
yeah,
making. I think
yeah.
Penny's
But
making
I
a point
think she-
generally about
yeah,
were we too optimistic in having that? I think is the
Well,
question.
I don't think we would ever have established relations with China unless we had signed the communique that, you know, that was one. I mean, there were these two parties, both of them claiming to be the legitimate government of China. If you're going to establish a relationship with a country, you've got to establish it with either this governing party or that governing party. We couldn't have recognized both the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. Would have been impossible. So if that's the one China that you mean, then it's not a question of optimism, it's just realism. And again, to some extent, it's realist with regard to Hong Kong, because we were not involved in the discussions between Britain and China about the terms of the return in 1997. It was inevitable that those discussions had to be had at some time. I think that, and I know there were certain pressures, there were certain particularly powerful companies that were pushing the British government to resolve this issue early, because they wanted to take out, finance which would go beyond 97, and they couldn't get finance from the bank unless the terms of the handover were settled. But in retrospect, I think perhaps they might have not been quite so precipitate in signing up as they did in 1984.
Maybe
Yeah.
that was too optimistic
Yeah.
in that time. Well, look, we might draw a line under it there. Thanks, Jocelyn, and thank you very much for presenting your worm's eye view based on the lifetime's involvement with China. It's been a real treat. And on behalf of the ACT branch of the Institute, let me present you with a small token appreciation. In the hope that you can come down the Hume Highway more often and see us again in Canberra. Now, before everyone goes off to warmer climes at home, let me just say that our next meeting is on the 2nd of July, and we're lucky to have the visiting Deputy Foreign Minister of Kosovo coming to speak to us about Kosovo's 16-year journey towards statehood. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. Thank you.